We took a shortcut in the forest. I wish we hadn't. The scream tore through the forest, raw and jagged, ripping through the suffocating silence like a knife. It wasn't just fear. It was something primal, desperate, the kind of sound that leaves a mark on your soul. "Sarah!" Josh yelled, his voice cracking as he ran toward the sound. The rest of us stood frozen, the trees pressing in around us like a living wall. I wanted to call out, to tell him to stop, but my throat felt locked, the words trapped behind a rising tide of panic. My eyes darted toward Nate, hoping for some kind of plan, but he was pale and trembling, his hand clutching the knife he'd pulled from his pack. Then we heard it again. "Help me." The voice was faint, fractured but unmistakably Sarah's. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, where the shadows swallowed everything. But something was wrong. "That's not her," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible, laced with a chilling certainty. Josh didn't stop. He disappeared into the dark, the underbrush snapping and crunching in his wake. I took a step forward, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. "Josh, wait!" The forest didn't answer, but something else did. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees, followed by a wet tearing sound that made my stomach churn. And then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. 3 hours earlier, we hadn't even known the side trail existed. We were laughing, carefree, our biggest concern being whether we'd brought enough water for the loop. The forest felt alive in the way that forests do, birds chirping, leaves rustling, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. Josh, ever the confident one, spotted the trail first. It wasn't really a trail, more like a faint gap between the trees, the undergrowth trampled just enough to suggest that someone, or something, had passed through recently. "Shortcut," he said, grinning and gesturing toward it, his confidence radiating outwards. "This'll get us back to the car faster." I hesitated, staring into the shadowy thicket. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. The others didn't share my unease. "Come on," Sarah said, brushing past me with her phone in hand, already snapping pictures of the moss-covered trees. "What's the worst that could happen?" Looking back, I wish I'd stopped them. I wish I'd turned around and taken the main trail back to safety. But instead, I followed, my gut twisting as we stepped into the unknown. It didn't take long for the forest to change. "It'll shave an hour off the loop," Josh said, peering into the shadowy thicket, his confidence unwavering, brushing off any concerns with a wave of his hand. "Trust me." "We're not supposed to leave the main trail," I countered, though my voice lacked conviction. Something about the path felt wrong. It wasn't overgrown exactly, but it didn't look like anyone had used it in a while either. By the time I decided to protest, the others were already moving. Even quiet Nate, who usually sided with me, gave me a shrug and trudged after them. I hesitated, standing there alone, staring into the trees. There was an odd stillness to them, a silence that felt too thick for a forest in late afternoon. But the others were laughing, calling for me, and I didn't want to be the killjoy. The first 20 minutes were uneventful, if slightly eerie. The trees grew denser as we walked, the air cooler. Josh kept trying to convince us we were making good time, though my watch disagreed. "See? Piece of cake," he said, pointing to a clearing up ahead. "We're probably almost—" He stopped mid-sentence. I followed his gaze, frowning. The clearing wasn't a clearing at all. It was a strange depression in the ground, as if something heavy had lain there recently, an unnatural indentation in the earth. The grass was flattened in concentric rings, with jagged claw-like tears in the earth. "Bear, maybe?" Nate suggested. But his voice was too light, like he didn't believe it. Josh laughed nervously, his confidence faltering slightly for the first time. "Yeah, probably just a bear." We skirted the edge of the depression, none of us willing to step closer. A few minutes later, the forest began to feel wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The trees all looked the same, their trunks oddly uniform, and the trail, if you could still call it that, seemed to shift subtly underfoot. And then the smell hit us. It was faint at first, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Sarah gagged. "Ugh! What is that?" The smell grew stronger as we pressed on, even though the others pretended not to notice. I could feel it clawing at the back of my throat, thick and coppery, like rust and rotting meat. That's when I heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping somewhere to our left. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Josh shook his head, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just an animal." But Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "No! That didn't sound right," she hissed, her face pale, her eyes wide with growing dread. We froze, listening. The silence was oppressive now, pressing in on all sides. Then came another sound, closer this time, a low, guttural noise that sent shivers racing down my spine. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't anything I could recognize. "Let's keep moving," Nate said, his voice trembling, betraying his fear. We picked up the pace, but the sounds didn't stop. Branches rustled, twigs snapped. Whatever was out there, it was following us. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart hammering. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, something tall and thin weaving between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Josh," I said, my voice cracking, "are we even going the right way?" "I think so," he muttered. But the confidence was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. We stumbled into another clearing, this one worse than the first. The ground was littered with bones. Animal, I told myself, though some looked worryingly large, some of the bones clearly not belonging to anything natural. In the center of the clearing was something else. A tattered piece of fabric, stained dark and half buried in the dirt. Sarah screamed, a piercing shriek of pure terror. Before I could stop her, she bolted back into the trees, her fear overriding any sense of caution. "Wait!" I shouted, but she was already gone. The three of us stood there, paralyzed, until we heard her scream again, this time farther away, muffled and abruptly cut off. And then we heard it. A voice. It came from the trees, soft and plaintive, like a child's whimper. "Help! Please! I'm hurt!" It sounded like Sarah, but it wasn't. The subtle distortion, the slight unnatural waver, was undeniably wrong. Josh, seemingly blind to this deception, didn't wait. He took off after the voice, crashing through the underbrush like a wild animal, driven by a misplaced sense of heroism. "Josh, stop!" I yelled. But he didn't even glance back, his tunnel vision focused on the sound. Nate and I hesitated for a moment, staring at each other with wide eyes, recognizing the danger, before the silence swallowed us whole again. We couldn't just leave him, or Sarah. My legs moved before my brain caught up, dragging me forward into the dense, suffocating forest. Nate followed close behind, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "That didn't sound right," he whispered as we ran, his words tumbling out, laced with dread. "That wasn't her. It was mimicking her voice." I didn't want to admit he might be right, but the unease was growing into a sickening certainty. The voice came again, weaker now, quivering, using Sarah's voice with an unsettling, almost mocking quality. "Please, help me." It sounded exactly like Sarah, but there was something off about it, like a recording played on a warped tape, the pitch wavering just slightly, too high, too low, stretching and compressing in ways a human voice shouldn't. Josh's frantic calls overlapped with it, his voice full of a desperate urgency. "Sarah, where are you? Keep talking. We're coming." He was ahead of us, his figure barely visible through the thick trees, moving faster than seemed possible, blindly charging towards what was clearly a trap. The forest felt wrong, even more so now, as if the trees were leaning in closer, their skeletal branches reaching for us, the very air thick with an oppressive malevolence. The trail we'd been on was gone, replaced by uneven ground, littered with rocks and gnarled roots that caught at our feet. Then we saw him. Josh was standing still in a small clearing, his back to us. The air was different here, heavier, suffocating, charged with an unseen energy. A faint mist clung to the ground, curling around his legs like pale, searching fingers, creating an unsettling and unnatural scene. "Josh," I called, my voice trembling, a knot of dread tightening in my chest. He didn't move. Nate grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight, his eyes wide with an almost primal terror. "Don't," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Josh," I called again, louder this time. My voice cracked, echoing unnaturally through the trees, bouncing off the unseen horror lurking in the shadows. He turned, finally, and my stomach plummeted, my blood turning to ice. His face was pale, almost gray, his eyes glassy and wide, fixed on something beyond us, an expression of chilling emptiness. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then he whispered, his voice a hollow echo of his former self. "She's here." I followed his gaze and froze, my heart seizing in my chest. At the edge of the clearing stood Sarah, or something that looked like her. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung in matted strands over her face, but her posture was wrong, stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings, controlled by some unseen force. Her head twitched slightly to one side, too fast, and then again, snapping back with a wet crunching sound, the sound a horrifying mixture of bone and something else, something that shouldn't exist. "Sarah?" I took a step forward, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to flee the unspeakable horror that stood before me. "Help me," she said, her voice thin and broken, a mockery of Sarah's plea, the words echoing with a disturbing artificiality. But her lips didn't move, the sound emanating from somewhere behind her, adding a layer of grotesque deception to the scene. Josh, completely enthralled by this illusion, took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, drawn to her like a moth to a flame, blindly following her into the darkness. "It's okay. We're here," he said, his voice trembling, completely falling for the trap. "No!" Nate barked, pulling me back, his voice a harsh warning, his face contorted with fear and urgency. "That's not her. Look at her feet." His warning was clear. I looked down and felt my blood run cold, my stomach clenching with a wave of pure horror. Her feet weren't touching the ground, suspended a few inches above the earth, defying the laws of nature. Josh, trapped in his deluded sense of heroism, didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. His mind clouded by the deception. He kept moving forward, drawn to her like a moth to a flame, blindly following her into the darkness. "Josh, stop!" I shouted, but it was too late, my warning falling on deaf ears. She moved suddenly, impossibly fast, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion, her movements unnaturally precise and unsettling. Her head snapped to the side again, and I caught a glimpse of something glinting in the dim light, teeth, sharp and jagged, far too large for her mouth, a grotesque parody of human features. Josh screamed, a sound I'll never forget, raw and primal, filled with a terror that didn't belong in this world, echoing the horror we all felt. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, and we saw the blood, a dark, glistening stream that poured through his fingers, coating his skin with a sickening viscosity. "Run!" Nate yelled, grabbing my hand and yanking me back into the trees, his voice cracking with panic. Josh's screams faded behind us, replaced by wet, tearing sounds that turned my stomach, sounds that no human throat could produce. I wanted to look back, but I couldn't, my body recoiling from the horror I had witnessed. We ran blindly, tripping over roots and crashing through branches, the forest a blur around us, a chaotic maze of shadows and dread. The air felt thicker with every step, each breath a struggle, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating us with its unnatural weight. The smell was back now, stronger than ever, clogging my throat and making my eyes water. The metallic stench now mingled with the sickly sweet odor of decay. And then the voice came again, using Josh's voice now. "Don't leave me." It wasn't Sarah this time. It was Josh. Or at least, the thing was using his voice, a horrible, twisted mockery of his desperate plea. The voice, that thing using Josh's voice, was getting closer, its source moving with an unnatural speed, tracking our every move. It sounded wounded, pitiful, but still carrying that same warped edge as before, a distorted plea that made my blood run cold. Nate and I didn't slow down. We didn't speak. I think we both knew instinctively that if we stopped, we wouldn't start again, that if the thing caught us, we would be torn apart, both physically and mentally. The trees grew darker, more tightly packed, as if the forest itself were trying to funnel us somewhere, pushing us deeper into its malevolent heart. The uneven ground clawed at our feet and Nate tripped, nearly taking me down with him, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I hauled him up, both of us breathing hard, our lungs burning with each desperate gasp, and we pressed on until the forest abruptly opened into another clearing, each step drawing us closer to the unknown. It was wrong, all wrong. The space was circular, too perfect to be natural, and the trees surrounding it leaned inward, their branches tangling overhead to form a grotesque canopy, a macabre parody of a natural space. The ground was bare dirt, scorched black in some places, a testament to some terrible ritual, and in the center stood a twisted wooden structure, a crude effigy of some kind, a sickening imitation of a human form. It looked vaguely human, but grotesquely stretched, its limbs branching off unnaturally like antlers, a horrific mockery of the natural world. But that wasn't the worst part. The air here. It hummed, not audibly, but in a way that resonated deep in my bones, a sickening vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur, the sound a tangible force pushing against my very being. I staggered back, grabbing Nate's arm for balance, my body rebelling against the unholy energy that permeated the space. "Do you feel that?" I whispered, though my voice sounded muffled, as if the clearing had swallowed the sound, the very air around us deadening any form of communication. Nate nodded, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the effigy, recognizing the horror of the scene. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent, driven by an instinctive need to escape. "Now." We turned to leave, but the forest behind us was gone. Or rather, it had changed, shifted into something alien and malevolent. The trees were no longer the tall, straight pines we'd been running through. These were older, gnarled things, their trunks impossibly thick and their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, a reflection of the horror we'd encountered. The path we'd come from had disappeared, replaced by dense thickets that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The very landscape of the forest alive and hostile. Nate took a shaky step forward, but I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his skin. "Wait," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath, fear gripping my heart with icy claws. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing, something was watching us, its gaze a palpable force. It was barely visible, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, a void in the very fabric of reality. But its eyes burned like embers, glowing faintly in the dim light, their unnatural glow sending shivers down my spine. They didn't blink, their gaze fixed on us with an unnerving intensity. I squeezed Nate's arm, my nails digging into his skin, trying to communicate the silent horror I was experiencing. "Do you see?" "Yeah," he cut me off, his voice trembling, his face a mask of pure fear. "I see it." We both stood frozen, unable to move, our bodies paralyzed with a dread that transcended any earthly fear, as the thing shifted slightly, its shape becoming more defined, revealing the grotesque reality of its existence. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and angular, a perversion of the human form. It didn't move like a person. It flowed, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn, its movements defying the laws of physics and nature. The humming in the air grew louder, sharper, like it was coming from the creature itself, the sound resonating through our very bones, shaking us from the inside out. My vision blurred, and I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my head, like my skull was being squeezed, the oppressive force threatening to crush my very being. Nate let out a choked sound and stumbled back, clutching his temples, the sheer horror of the creature's presence threatening to overwhelm him. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing the dread that permeated the air. And that's when I noticed it. It was holding something that made my stomach churn with a renewed wave of horror. A scrap of fabric, torn and blood-stained. Sarah's jacket. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I couldn't look away, my eyes drawn to the horrible truth it represented. The creature raised its free hand and pointed at us, long, spindly fingers that ended in claws, nails sharpened into unnatural points, the very sight a terrifying warning. And the humming stopped. The silence was deafening, a silence so profound it felt as if the world had ceased to exist. Then, from deep within the forest, we heard it. A low, guttural call, like a distorted imitation of a wolf's howl, a sound that echoed the malice of the forest itself. "Run," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible, a desperate plea in the face of certain doom. We bolted, diving into the twisted forest without any sense of direction, our instincts driving us to escape the horror behind us. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle, our lungs burning with each desperate gasp. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Not if we wanted to survive. The forest seemed alive, branches reaching for us, roots rising to trip us, the very environment itself a participant in our torment. The howls grew louder, echoing from all sides now, the chorus of a predatory horror closing in, and I realized with dawning horror that they weren't coming from just one creature. There were more, far more than we could possibly handle. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound twisted into something unnatural, every rustle of leaves a sign of impending doom. Nate grabbed my hand, pulling me forward as I stumbled over a root, his grip tight, our lives intertwined in this desperate race for survival, and we burst through another thicket into an open space. This time, it wasn't a clearing. It was the edge of a ravine, a sheer drop into blackness that seemed to go on forever, a gaping maw waiting to swallow us whole. We skidded to a stop, teetering dangerously close to the edge, the ground crumbling under our feet, a horrifying testament to our desperate situation. "Now what?" I gasped, looking frantically for another way out, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, desperation clawing at my throat. But the forest was closing in behind us, the howls growing louder, closer, a chorus of unnatural rage, the very sound a death sentence. Nate turned to me, his face pale but determined, his eyes burning with a strange mix of fear and resolve. his will to survive stronger than the fear that threatened to consume us. "We fight it," he said, pulling a hunting knife from his pack, the blade gleaming with an unnatural light, a pathetic attempt at defiance against the horrors closing in. I hadn't even known he had it, a desperate, almost foolish attempt at defense. "Fight what?" I demanded, panic bubbling over, my voice trembling, knowing the absurdity of our situation. "We don't even know what it is." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the forest, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and grim determination. And that's when I saw them, dozens of glowing eyes, moving through the trees, too many to count, each one a promise of our impending doom. The creatures were closing in, their distorted shapes weaving between the trunks like smoke, their forms shifting in unnatural ways, defying the logic of the natural world. And then, from somewhere deep inside me, something shifted, something snapped. A strange clarity settled over me, cold and sharp, overriding the fear that had gripped me. I picked up a heavy branch from the ground, the wood rough and coarse against my skin, my hands trembling but steady enough to hold it, an act of futile defiance against the impossible horror that awaited us. If this was the end, we weren't going down without a fight. We would not become willing sacrifices to whatever horrors lurked in the forest. We would rage against the dying of the light. Nate's knuckles were white as he gripped the knife, his breath coming fast and shallow, his face a mask of determination, the fear still present, but momentarily subdued by a surge of adrenaline. I held the branch in front of me like it could actually do something against whatever this was, knowing that we had no chance, but still willing to fight until our last breath. The glowing eyes moved closer, their light reflecting off something slick and wet, a sickening glint that betrayed their monstrous nature. The creatures, if you could even call them that, emerged from the shadows, revealing themselves in the dim, unnatural glow of the ravine's edge, their true forms finally revealed. They weren't uniform in shape, a macabre collection of monstrosities that defied the very laws of nature. Some were tall and impossibly thin, their elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws, their forms skeletal and unnatural, their presence alone enough to chill the blood. Others were smaller, hunched, their backs bristling with spines that jutted out at grotesque angles, their bodies a twisted mockery of any earthly creature. Their skin, or whatever passed for skin, was mottled and raw, as if it had been flayed and poorly stitched back together, a horrific tapestry of exposed flesh and bone. Worst of all were their faces, or lack thereof. What should have been features were hollow indentations, smeared shadows, or pulsing masses of flesh, a perversion of human features that sent shivers down my spine. The humming sound returned, louder than ever, vibrating through the ground and into my chest, a palpable force that threatened to shatter our very bones. It wasn't just noise. It was pressure, burrowing into my skull and making my vision warp, our very sanity threatened by its insidious presence. My grip on the branch faltered, my arms trembling, as if the sound was sapping my strength, the unnatural energy of the forest turning against us. Nate took a step forward, raising the knife, a futile act of defiance against the overwhelming power that faced us. His voice was a hoarse whisper, a desperate plea to the creatures. "Stay back." The nearest creature tilted its head, as if curious, then opened its mouth, its movements jerky and unnatural, a disturbing imitation of human curiosity. There was no sound, but I could feel it, a palpable wave of dread washing over me, threatening to drown me in its icy depths. Its mouth was a yawning chasm of jagged teeth, shifting and rearranging themselves like something alive, a living nightmare that stretched beyond the limits of human comprehension. Another one moved forward, faster than I could follow, its spindly limbs scuttling like a spider's, a blur of unnatural motion that sent my stomach into my throat. It lunged at Nate, and he swung the knife wildly, catching it across the torso, his movement clumsy but desperate, his will to survive overriding any sense of proper combat. A thick, black ichor sprayed from the wound, hitting the ground with a hiss and filling the air with the stench of burning hair and decay, the horrific mixture causing a new wave of nausea to wash over me. The creature shrieked, an ear-piercing, unnatural sound that didn't stop when it should have, a chorus of pain and rage that echoed through the forest. The others responded, their guttural cries merging into a deafening cacophony, a symphony of death and decay. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Nate's arm and pulling him back from the advancing swarm, knowing the futility of our actions but unable to accept our inevitable doom. But there was nowhere to run. Behind us was the sheer drop of the ravine, a black abyss that offered no escape, and the creatures were closing in on every side, their forms a twisted parody of the natural world. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to do something. But what could I do? The humming grew sharper, more invasive, until I thought my skull might crack under the pressure, the oppressive force threatening to destroy our very essence. And then, as if responding to some unseen signal, the creatures stopped. Every one of them froze, their heads turning in unison toward the center of the clearing, their movements mechanical and unnatural, responding to an unseen puppeteer. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped, my heart sinking into a pit of despair. The ground beneath the effigy was shifting, twisting in unnatural ways. The blackened earth cracked and bulged as something pushed its way to the surface, an unholy birth that twisted the fabric of reality. Long, spindly fingers, no, roots, broke through the soil, writhing like they were alive, each movement betraying a horrific sentience. The effigy itself began to twist and contort, its wooden limbs splintering as something massive and wrong forced its way out from within, a grotesque parody of life that defied all reason. It wasn't just one creature, it was all of them, a horrifying amalgamation of flesh and bone and wood and root, a grotesque mockery of existence. Dozens of limbs and faces and bodies fused together in a writhing, pulsating mass that defied reason, a living nightmare that stretched beyond the limits of human comprehension. Eyes blinked open along its surface, too many to count, each one staring directly at us, their gazes devoid of any humanity. The air grew colder, the pressure more intense, as if the thing was sucking the life out of the forest itself, the very essence of the natural world recoiling in horror. The creatures around us began to kneel, their twisted forms bowing toward the abomination in reverence. Their actions controlled by the will of the monstrous thing that had been birthed before our very eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my legs were locked in place, my body paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing, my mind unable to comprehend the horrors unfolding before me. Nate grabbed my arm, his voice barely audible over the sound of the humming and the shifting earth, his grip tight, his face a mask of despair. "We have to jump!" "What?" I turned to him, my voice shaking, my mind unable to process his words. "Are you insane?" He pointed to the ravine, the black abyss a terrifying alternative to the monstrosity before us. "It's either that or this," he whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of our impossible situation, the words a grim acceptance of our inevitable fate. The thing in the clearing let out a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through my bones, a sound that was not of this world, a horrific declaration of our impending demise. One of its massive, root-like limbs reached toward us, stretching impossibly far, its movements slow and deliberate, a terrifying display of its unnatural power. I didn't think. I couldn't. I grabbed Nate's hand, our fingers intertwined in a desperate grip, and together we leapt into the darkness, a leap of faith into the unknown. For a moment, there was nothing but the rush of air and the pounding of my heart, the deafening silence of the void engulfing us. Then we hit water. Icy, bone-chilling water that knocked the breath from my lungs. The cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the forest. The current was strong, dragging us along like rag dolls, the force of the water threatening to tear us apart. I fought to the surface, gasping for air, my lungs burning with each desperate breath, and caught a glimpse of Nate ahead of me, struggling to keep his head above the water, his face pale and drawn. The ravine walls were high, the trees above a jagged silhouette against the faint light of the moon, a distant reminder of the world we had left behind. The creatures didn't follow, their influence limited to the forest itself. Whatever horror we'd left behind seemed bound to the forest, unwilling or unable to chase us into the depths, a temporary reprieve, but one that offered no guarantee of safety. We floated for what felt like hours before the current slowed, depositing us onto a rocky shore, bruised and battered, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. I crawled onto the slick stones, coughing and shivering, and collapsed beside Nate, our bodies broken, but our wills still alive. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence, a heavy shroud that mirrored the horror we had endured. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice a hoarse whisper, the words heavy with the weight of our experience. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, unable to answer, my mind still reeling from the unholy horror that we had witnessed, the very memory a wound that would never fully heal, the memory of the thing in the clearing, the way it moved, the way it looked at us, was burned into my mind, an eternal scar on my soul. But worse than that was the feeling, the certainty, that it wasn't over, that we had not escaped its grasp entirely. We'd escaped the forest, but something told me we hadn't left it behind, not completely, that the darkness had followed us out, clinging to our shadows, a constant reminder of the horrors we had survived. My son's camera monitor alerted in the middle of the night. I checked it and saw my wife and son sitting on the bed. They weren't my wife and son. I'm a nurse, currently pulling night shifts. It's a real drag, but I'm hoping to switch to days soon, with some co-workers planning on retiring. Anyway, one night, a little after 3 a.m., my son's monitor buzzed with sound and movement. No big deal. He probably just coughed or sneezed. He's 3, so he usually sleeps through the night. I pulled up the app on my phone and saw him and my wife sitting on the bed. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe he'd cried out or got scared. I was about to close the app when I noticed something strange, almost creepy. And when I say almost creepy, I mean downright unsettling. They were both sitting on the bed, just staring up at the camera with these blank, emotionless stares. The night vision was black and white, which made their eyes look white and eerie. They didn't move. Aside from their breathing, they just sat there, staring. I closed the app and called my wife to make sure everything was okay. I never get to call home during my lunch break, so this was kind of nice, talking to my family from work. It rang a few times before she answered with a very groggy, "Hello?" She sounded dead asleep when I called, but looked wide awake on the camera. "Hey, you guys okay?" "Huh?" "Yeah. Buddy," my son's nickname, came in like 15 minutes ago. Seemed scared, so I told him he could sleep with Mama. I was confused, since I'd just seen them in his room a minute ago. Literally 60 seconds had passed since I closed the app and made the call. "Wait, so you're in bed?" "Yeah, I fell right back asleep. Is everything okay? Everybody keeps waking me up." She was a little annoyed. "Hang on a second." I put her on speaker and opened the app, hoping I wouldn't see it. When the app loaded, I got that intense feeling of dread in my stomach, like when I was a kid and realized, while eating breakfast, a big project was due that day that I hadn't done. My heart leapt into my throat. My wife and son were sitting on his bed, staring up at the camera with those same emotionless eyes. "Hello? You guys are in bed, right?" "Yeah, we're trying to sleep." "Well, I'm looking at his camera and I see you two sitting on his bed." "Huh? No, we're in our bed." "I know that's what you mean, but I'm looking at his bed and you two are there." "Hang on," she said. She was quiet for a second while she opened the camera on her phone. I heard this guttural, terrified gasp. It sounded like she had sucked all the air in the room into her lungs. I don't often hear that kind of gasp from her. Only when she's really scared, like during a jump scare in a movie, or that one time we looked away from our son for a second, and he was by the mailbox, inches from the road. I heard the rustling of sheets, and the line went dead. Of course, I was terrified, so I called right back. It went to voicemail, so I called again. And again, with no answer. Finally, after about 4 minutes, she called me. Those 4 minutes felt like 40 years. "Hey, what's happening?" I asked. She was hysterical and crying. I couldn't understand a word she said. "Stop! Slow down for a second," I said. She slowed down enough to explain they were in the car, driving to her parents'. She had looked at the camera, and when she saw what was on it, she grabbed our son, rushed downstairs and out the door. She hadn't even closed the garage. "Don't worry about it," I said. "I'll drive by when I get off and close it." We live in a safe neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried. "You are not going in there," she said. "Hell no," I replied. "Why are we on the camera?" she asked. "Is it a recording?" "I don't know," I replied. "I'm going to keep watching it and see if there's anything I can tell. Do our code words with Buddy." We have code words because we're nerds. We've seen too many pod people and imposter movies, so we made code words to tell if one of us was an imposter. We have a few code words and a 3-sentence story we recite, each saying different parts. I heard her on the phone saying the things we taught our son. He giggled, as he always does, since he thinks they are a joke, with no idea of their meaning. We were both convinced he was our son. My wife said her part, and I was sure it was her. We made up these words as a complete joke. I never imagined we'd actually need them. Unreal. She got to her parents safely, and it was hard to hang up. I told her we'd figure it out in the morning. Maybe it was just a glitch. She didn't think so. When she was running out, she had to pass our son's room, and the door was open. There's a little flashing light on the back of the camera that indicates it's connected to the internet. It gave off enough light that when she ran by, she thought she saw a shadowy outline of what could have been an adult sitting on our son's bed. It sent chills down my spine. Knowing they were safe was the only thing that kept me at work that night. It was a long 4 hours, but I checked the camera whenever I could. They were still sitting on the bed, staring with those same emotionless gazes. I studied them, looking for patterns, from their breathing to their blinking. Their breathing was steady and normal. Their blinking would tell me if this was just a bizarre, time-looped video or not. I stared at my phone, counting the seconds between blinks, telling myself if it was a loop, their blinks would be even, and at the same time. But there was no pattern. It was erratic and random, just like a normal person. The passing hours confirmed that it wasn't just some weird looped video. My son's window was visible, and I could see it getting lighter outside his room. His curtains kept out enough light to prevent the camera from exiting night vision, but let in enough to tell that the sun was rising. I tried to figure out what to do before I left work. Calling the police came to mind, but I talked myself out of it. What was I supposed to say? Someone in my house looks like my wife, but isn't? Worse yet, what if they are some kind of entity, and the police going over there could get them hurt? I decided to tell a coworker about it. He believes in the paranormal, and might have a suggestion. I showed him the video and told him the story. His initial response of, "That's creepy as hell," wasn't helpful, but he said he wanted to go check it out. He said we both should, to see if not my wife, would try to act like my wife. I said absolutely not, but he insisted we should at least go to the house, even if we don't go in. I agreed, since I needed to close the garage. We got to my house and walked around the perimeter first. Not sure why, but it felt like we should. The curtains were all closed, since no one was there to open them, so we couldn't see anything. I went to close the garage, and suddenly had this overwhelming urge to go inside and investigate. It was like I just had to know what was going on. So, we went in. We walked through the kitchen towards the foyer where the stairs are. It was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. We stopped at the bottom of the stairs and waited a few seconds. I checked the camera again, and they were still sitting there. I had never been so scared. My co-worker put his foot on the first step, and I yelled, "Stop!" suddenly. "Forget this. We're out of here, I told him. "Come on." I started back to the kitchen. We heard a loud creak from upstairs. It was my son's room. He has a very loud, creaky floorboard in the middle of his floor that's almost impossible not to step on. My wife and I are still deciding whether to fix it, because it will alert us if he's ever sneaking out when he gets older. "Come on! Come on! Come on!" I yelled, motioning for him to move. We were out of the house in about 2 seconds. Out on the street, I checked my phone. Now, only Not My Son was sitting on the bed, same blank stare. Not My Wife was gone. "Holy crap," my co-worker said. "That was stupid as hell. Do not tell my wife we went inside." She would be so angry if she found out. I used my garage door opener in my car to close the door. Before we left, I looked at the camera again. Not My Wife was back on the bed with Not My Son, both staring blankly up at the camera, blinking every few seconds. That was about 4 days ago now. Not My Wife and Not My Son are still sitting on the bed, staring up at the camera. They haven't moved a millimeter. We obviously haven't gone back to our house. What do we do? I'm sorry. It's taken so long. It's been an emotional month. I felt like I'm losing my mind, or already lost it. I've been in the hospital for 3 weeks. You'll remember I left off at my wife's parents' house, not knowing what the heck to do. My wife and I argued about it. My in-laws said to call a priest. I told my wife we were calling the cops, and that was it. The day we finally called the cops was day 6. Not My family was still sitting on the bed, staring at the camera. I told the dispatcher there were intruders in my house, leaving out the part about them looking exactly like my family. I said we were out of the house, but I would meet the police there. She dispatched 2 units. My wife begged me not to go. I told her I had to be there, that I had a plan. I would take her mom's iPhone and FaceTime her, while showing the police the camera on my phone. They would see this was a messed up situation, and hopefully be cautious. My co-worker friend said he would come with me. My friend and I got to my house before the cops. Like many of you mentioned in the comments, I was packing heat. I have a concealed carry permit, so I had my 1911 .45 on me. I wasn't worried about the cops. I was going to tell them I was carrying. What I wasn't going to tell them was that I had my father-in-law's AR-15 in my trunk. It's almost funny how many of you suggested that in my previous entry. I didn't plan on telling the cops because I wasn't planning on needing it. They would come armed and ready. They showed up, and I let them know I was armed. Then I put my plan into action. I initially told them the story. They looked at each other like I was nuts and didn't believe me. I FaceTimed my wife so they could see she was, in fact, not in the house, despite what the camera was showing. They still seemed skeptical, but it did pique their interest. I hung up with my wife and said I'd call as soon as we knew anything. "So now we're sure this isn't a recording," an officer said, repeating what I'd said. "It's not. The day-night cycle has changed every day. Their blinking is erratic and not cyclical, like a repeat," I explained. "I know it's a stupid question, but your wife isn't a twin?" the other officer asked. I told him no. My friend spoke up. "I have an idea. Turn the volume up. I'll go throw a pebble at the window. He went around back while I maxed out the volume. Okay, I'm tossing. We heard the light tick sound from outside, but the 1 second delay on the camera came in loud and clear through my phone. Not my wife moved at the sound of the pebble, the first time I'd seen her move, aside from when she wasn't on screen when I went into our house the first day. She turned her head slightly toward the window, before turning back to the camera. Okay, so this is live, an officer said. Okay, sir. I need you and your friend to stay out here. We're going in to find out what's going on. Should you ask for more units? I asked hopefully. Not at this time. We're going to butts the situation first. They don't appear to be armed, but we're going to be cautious. I opened the garage for them, and they went in toward my kitchen door. They radioed dispatch that they were headed in and to stand by. They disappeared into my house. A few seconds after they went in, the camera went out. I felt like throwing up and like I could feel my heart in my throat. Crap! I yelled to my friend. I popped the trunk, grabbed my rifle, and ran into the garage, my friend right behind me. We got inside just in time to hear a low, guttural howl from upstairs, demonic almost, along with raised voices from the police. Then there were several shots. Need backup! Shots fire! He was cut off. Oh my God! My friend howled. He was terrified, and so was I. God darn it, I knew it, I said, running up the stairs. My son's room is the first one you come to after getting upstairs, so his wall is also what you see as you walk up. As I reached the top, I unloaded my rifle into the wall. It has a 30-round magazine, but I felt like I fired 100 shots. I fired everywhere, knowing the ammo would go through the wall like paper, concentrating on where my son's bed would be, but also near the door and toward the floor in case they tried to duck. We heard shrieks of pain from the room, then nothing. My friend and I paused before going in because the camera was still out. We heard whimpering coming from the room. There was a dead cop in the hallway we had to step over. It was awful, and I'll never forget it. His head was a few feet away from his body in the doorway to our guest room. We found the other cop in my son's room right inside the door. He had several large holes in his torso, like he'd been impaled. What I'd been afraid of had happened. I called the cops, and whatever these things were unalived them. When we entered the room, we found that the whimpering was coming from not my wife. She was on her back on the floor, holding her bullet-ridden torso and breathing heavily. The scene was terrible. I can barely put into words how awful it was. I know now, just like I did then, they weren't my family. It shouldn't have been hard. I should have been able to go in and finish it. But instead, I fell to my knees. Not my wife, begged for her life. I don't want to die, honey, she whimpered. I wanted to have more kids. I can't die now. I looked over at not my son, who had to be dead. He'd taken at least 2 shots to the head, or what was left of it. He had several more in his torso, and 1 or 2 in his legs and arms. If you have kids, seeing their lifeless, bullet-ridden body is a special kind of hell. Again, I knew it wasn't my son, but it was. I was going to be sick. I'd unalived my family. I turned back to not my wife. She was acting just like my wife. She even mimicked her anxiety about death. It's not her, man. I forgot my friend was even there. It's not her. Shoot it. I know what you guys are thinking. How many times has this happened in movies, and you scream at the TV for the main character to just shoot the imposter because it's not their loved one? I guess movies get it right sometimes. I'll never roll my eyes at the character who can't kill an imposter again. Please don't shoot me, it begged. My hands were shaking as I aimed at it. Why couldn't I do it? I knew this wasn't my wife. Listen, man, my friend began calmly. Look at it. Its blood is yellow. It's not your family. Was it yellow? It was. Seeing my family slain was so traumatic, I hadn't even noticed their blood wasn't red. I steadied my aim, and not my wife suddenly stopped begging. She began that guttural, terrifying shriek, and something black or gray started to protrude from her mouth like a tentacle, and I fired. At that range, her head more or less exploded. Whatever these things were, they appeared to be mortal. I was still on my knees, and my friend was in the hallway just outside the door. We heard the sounds of police sirens approaching. I'd forgotten one of the cops had gotten a shots-fired call over the radio before being unalived. It seemed like hours, but it had only been about 5 minutes since the police had gone in. My friend went downstairs to let the police know what to expect. I stood up and slowly made my way into the hallway. I was lightheaded and felt sick. My bedroom is next to my son's, so the doorway is a foot to the right of his door. My door was closed, but as I exited my son's room, my door opened. Notmi walked out into the hallway wearing the same thing I was. I was shocked. I couldn't move, but it did. It walked toward me, and its right arm turned black and morphed into a tentacle. It wiggled like a squid or octopus arm. When it thrust its arm at me, it solidified and impaled me through my abdomen. It then stabbed me in the left leg, just above the kneecap. I fell to the ground in pain. Its tentacle arm was wiggling again. "Why did you kill my family?" it asked. When it spoke, its voice changed pitch several times. It was my voice, then much deeper, then normal again. It alternated several times, saying that one sentence. It moved closer. The rifle was gone, but I still had my .45. I pulled it out and got a shot off in its right knee. It howled. As Notmi fell to his knee, I fired a couple more shots, hitting its abdomen and left side. It breathed heavily before I aimed and shot Notmi in the face. Its blood was also yellow. I lay there, bleeding out, thinking this was it for sure. I still had some strength from adrenaline, so I took off my belt and tried to make a tourniquet for my leg. With my stomach wound, it was hard to tighten it. I then took my shirt off, balled it up, and packed my stomach wound, applying as much pressure as I could. Being a nurse probably saved my life. I passed out, but the measures I took must have kept me alive long enough for EMS to arrive. I heard voices and the sound of pounding on the stairs before I went out. It was probably a cop, but I felt someone trying to pack my wound before I went out. I was in and out of consciousness as EMS arrived with probably every cop in the city. I was wheeled downstairs and put in an ambulance. As I was being loaded onto the gurney, I heard cops freaking out, and rightfully so. They had lost 2 brothers, and there were 3 other bodies. Did he kill his brother? Are they twins? Probably referring to Notmi's dead body. Or his whole family. Put him on armed guard while at the hospital. He'll probably be getting charged. As I was getting placed in the ambulance, I saw my friend talking to about 10 cops, all listening intently. I went out again in the ambulance. I woke up in the ER. My wounds had been treated. The tentacle hadn't been more than a few inches wide, so it was just slightly larger than a knife. They'd sewn me up, and I found I was getting a blood transfusion due to blood loss at my house. My wife had authorized them to do whatever they needed while I was unconscious. She was also extremely mad that I went in the house. We're okay now, but that's a story for another day. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks since I ended up getting an infection and almost went septic. I needed lots of antibiotics. The entire time I had cops in my room asking questions. After about a week, they released me from armed guard. I told them everything, not caring if it made sense or not, and thank God my friend came with me since he could back up my weird story. Midway through my hospital stay, men in suits came to visit. They were government. I knew right away. They said they were FBI, but I don't know if I believe that. They wanted to talk about not my family. The police chief and coroner were involved, and it was very hush-hush. They made it clear this wasn't to get out to the public. This is where I have to apologize for probably an anticlimactic ending. I don't know what not me and my family were. Neither do they. The only thing we know is that they were sentient creatures that looked like us and had yellow blood. I begged the coroner to tell me about their autopsies, but he said he wasn't allowed to say. He must have felt bad for me since I got flowers a couple of days later. The card said, "We don't know what they are. They have the same organs as us, but in different parts of their body, aside from their brain. What's red and pink inside us is green and yellow inside them. They're humanoid creatures, but whatever they aren't human. The government thinks they may be extraterrestrial. Destroy this letter ASAP. We had our house cleaned professionally. It was almost certainly a government team since they contacted us on behalf of the police. We couldn't find any Google reviews or websites for the company. My wife and I are not going back to our house. We would love to burn it down, but there's no way to do that and avoid suspicion of arson. We'll end up taking a huge loss on the property, since everyone knows there was an incident involving multiple deaths, but don't know what happened. It'll be hard to sell, but it will eventually. We're going to move on from here. I told everyone at work it was a home invasion, and they bought it. I'll go back to work in a couple of weeks, and we'll start looking for a new house. Again, I'm sorry. I know everyone wanted a concrete ending and to know exactly what the heck those things were. But we just don't know. Aliens sound good to me. I've been thinking if they were supernatural or demons, gunfire wouldn't have been able to kill them. It's hard to say. If they were aliens, why did they just sit there and creep in our house for a week? They didn't even try to take over our lives. It's hard to wrap my head around. If it is aliens, keep your eyes peeled. There could be more of them. Maria on the Moon. Did you know that early astronomers thought there were oceans on the moon? I asked, looking up from my book. My mom shifted in her bed, a tangle of IV tubes shifting with her. Of course. The moon seems like the perfect place to find an ocean. What a shame we never found water then, I said. Because those false seas, astronomers called them Maria. Mom smiled. How sweet of them to name the moon oceans after me. Well, they didn't find any oceans, I reminded her. Maybe they just didn't look hard enough, she replied, a little laugh slipping from her lips. For all the pain she was in, all the fear she must feel, my mother always had the kind of laugh that could light a candle. We were in her hospital room, the same one we'd been in and out of for the last year and a half. Sometimes we had a roommate, sometimes we were alone. Always she held steady enough for both of us. The rock I tied my hope to, the wall against the grief I knew was coming. Cancer is such a mundane word for something so hungry and cruel. I've noticed medicine does that a lot, covers horror with tedious language like a bedsheet over a body. Malignant, inoperable, metastasized, terminal. But when she laughed, we weren't in the hospital anymore. We were home. When she laughed, she wasn't sick. She was young again, and I was a kid, and the world was a bright place begging to be explored. What a miracle my mother was. Cancer had taken so much from her, aged and hurt her, but it could never steal her laugh. That was hers to keep. "How are we feeling today?" the doctor asked. He came in less and less often. We could all sense this was the final stay in this room. "Just brilliant, Doc," my mom said, struggling to sit a little higher. "We can still go dancing later, if you'd like, though we'll have to ask for my son's blessing. Ever since his dad died, Brian's been very protective of me." I put on a stern face. "I'll need to know your intentions are pure, Dr. Bradshaw." "As the driven snow," he played along. "But I might need a rain check on the dance, Ms. Willen. I'm not as young as I used to be." He emphasized his age, running his fingers through gray-white hair. My mom tapped her bare scalp. "Right there with you, Tiger," she said. Dr. Bradshaw smiled, but I could tell he was burdened. I saw him glance at the small idol I'd placed on my mother's nightstand. The talisman was a miniature oak tree carved from gray soapstone. There were 4 faces etched into the tree, a sentry against ill health and bitter spirits. I could tell the stone tree made the doctor uncomfortable. In all honesty, I had a tough time looking at the idol for more than a few seconds. The faces were each whittled in vivid expression. The face closest to my mother's bed was smiling kindly, and the face pointed towards the door was snarling, meant to ward away harm. The final two faces were both weeping. All four shapes were too human, too raw. There was a weirdness to the stone tree that put people on edge, but I'd grown used to every shade of weird you can imagine. My mother's side of the family was full of stories of unexplained luck and mysterious tragedy, whispered secrets, and unexplained deaths. By all accounts, my maternal grandmother was either an honest-to-goodness witch or full-bore, high-caliber crazy, or both. Probably both. The stone tree was from a box of my grandmother's things I'd found in the attic earlier that month. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but my mom did seem to get a bit better when I'd brought in the talisman, at least for a little while. I was daydreaming about family history and the odd box, while Dr. Bradshaw checked his charts and Mom's vitals. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, ripping me back to reality. Dr. Bradshaw tried to keep a light tone, but I could tell he didn't have good news. The hospital hallway smelled like ammonia and birthday cake. Someone must have had a party, maybe a patient, maybe a nurse. Strange how you remember the insignificant details while your world is crashing down around you. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Bradshaw told me. "The results came in this morning. It's spreading aggressively. We held it back as long as we could, Brian. Your mom is a fighter, but right now we just need to try to keep her as comfortable as we can." "Brian?" The wall was cracking, grief waiting on the other side, heavy and cold as an empty house. I'd known for months that this was the most likely outcome, but it still hurt to hear. Hurt worse than I could stomach. "There's nothing left to try?" I asked, fighting down the urge to throw up. "Anything? Experimental? Untested? Anything?" Dr. Bradshaw shook his head. "I'm sorry. Sometimes we just run out of options. She fought a good fight." "How long does she have left?" I asked, looking back into her room. She'd fallen asleep. "Not long. Maybe days. Have you considered hospice?" The smell of ammonia and birthday cake. The steady beep of Mom's heart monitor. I tried to focus on the world around me. My hope wasn't dead yet. If medicine couldn't help my mom, maybe something older could. I thought of the box of my grandmother's things waiting in the attic. There was a lot in there I hadn't gone through yet. Books and candles and secrets and lost things. Maybe there was a cure, or at least a way to keep the fight going. "No," I said. "If all that's left is to make her comfortable, I want to take her home." The doctor smiled. "I understand. We can give you some medication, ways to help her with the pain." He put his hand on my shoulder. "Your mom's been in a lot of pain, but she'll have peace soon. You've done all you can." "I know," I lied. "Thank you." Mom lived in a small ranch house 10 miles outside of town. There wasn't much in the way of neighbors besides some woods and a creek slithering through her yard. It was a windy, warm March afternoon when I took my dying mother home. That night I began my work. I was going to turn the house into a bunker, a maze death could never solve. I would keep my mother safe. I would find a way to keep her alive. The little red book was full of ideas. Running water was an obvious place to start. The creek behind the house was barely a trickle, but it should provide some coverage to the south side of the property. Salt was next, lining the doorways and window frames, then in an unbroken circle around the entire house. This step was to be repeated daily, the red book stressed, or even multiple times per day. Even a moderate breeze played holy havoc with any salt poured outside, so it was always best to trace and retrace every few hours. Water and salt were common defenses against man's oldest enemy, and well known. The book offered other, less conventional advice. It took me nearly a week to finish carving the symbols and signs into the walls, the floors, even the trees on the property. Sometime around noon on the third day, on my back in the crawl space, etching strange marks onto the underside of the floor. It struck me how ridiculous I was acting. There was no proof that any of the information in the little red book was anything other than the delusional ramblings of a bizarre woman I'd only met once or twice as a child. For all I knew, the runes meant to ward off death were actually a grocery list written in Cantonese. But I was desperate, and every time I saw my mother, she looked frailer, more fragile. So I continued carving and praying and building layers upon layers of protections to keep death far away. Making my marks took me all over the property. It was a big yard, nearly 3 acres that blended gradually into the surrounding forest. I wasn't able to pinpoint the exact boundary where cultivated met nature. The edges simply bled together, but I did my best to create a clean border with lines between the symbols. I'd always loved the wildness here, the way you could wander a few hundred yards away from home and feel like you'd traveled hundreds of years into the past to somewhere primal. This was the perfect playground for a kid. Whether I was out exploring trails or trapping minnows or spending the summer building yet another treehouse, convinced this would be the final one. It never was. I was never satisfied. The house itself, though small, was more than enough room for my mother and me. Dad died when I was 7. I don't remember much about him, just how big he seemed, with a bonfire grin and arms that I thought could hold the whole world. My mom often said I took after my father. I could see it in the old pictures of him. We had the same eyes, green as moss in the summer, and the same fiery shock of red hair, enemy to every comb on the planet. It seemed better to leave the box up in the attic, only taking down objects as I needed them. Up here, at least, my grandmother's items, her legacy was quarantined. The Red Book was very specific about the distribution of the totems around the house and property. I walked carefully through my mom's backyard, boots plopping in and out of mud, compass in hand. It had rained nearly every day since I'd taken my mom home from the hospital. I knew it was almost certainly a coincidence, but couldn't help wonder if the soft curtains of rain falling to the ground were for her. I placed charms in a compass rose with the house in the middle. The most disturbing objects were given places of honor at each cardinal direction. Water, salt, wards, charms, all placed carefully, intentionally. My grandmother's book promised that these would offer some degree of protection against the inevitability of death. The symbols would confuse it, the talismans distract it, and the water and salt make barriers to slow it down. But death might still find a crack to slip through, so the Red Book recommended one final trick. There was a small candle in the bottom of the box, dirty white as stained paper. When I took the candle from its case, the smell made me gag. Have you ever walked past a portable toilet in the dog days of summer? When it's so hot, the blue plastic has started to warp and bubble. Imagine that smell distilled into a finger's worth of wax. I brought the candle downstairs, placed it on the dining room table and set it alight. The wick caught immediately, the flame burning an unusual red-brown. No heat came off of the candle, and it actually seemed cooler the closer I moved my hand to the fire. Once the wax began to melt, the smell was 10 times worse than it was back in the attic. I choked down a greasy sickness crawling up my throat and quickly left the room, shutting the French doors as I went. That helped trap the odor, but I couldn't shake the sense of nausea. I went to check on my mother. "Do you remember the day you ran away?" my mom asked, sitting in her bed, lunch untouched on the nightstand beside her. I didn't think she had any weight left to lose before she was nothing but bone and memory. Her skin was rice paper over a frame that seemed smaller every day. Her eyes, though, no matter how fragile the rest of her became, remained 2 little lanterns against the dark, blue and bright and alive. "I didn't make it very far," I answered. "And I wasn't really running away, only stretching my legs." Mom smiled. "You told me you were leaving for the circus. You wanted to be either a lion tamer or a strongman or maybe a fire eater. I think I wanted to be all of that combined. Young me was big on multitasking." My mother turned, so she was looking out the window into the yard. I was so scared when I found your note, the one saying you were leaving. My hands were shaking like you wouldn't believe when I called the sheriff, and then Mr. Jonas down the way. It felt like we were searching for you for half the night, even though it couldn't have been more than an hour before we found you there, lost in the woods, wandering around and shivering. You hadn't even brought a jacket. I sat next to my mom on the bed. Yeah, I didn't exactly plan ahead for my circus escape. I remember getting over the idea real quick, but I couldn't find my way back. I'm glad you found me. I'm glad too, my mother said, and I noticed her wipe away a tear. I'm so glad. That hour you were gone, Brian. That was the most afraid I've ever been. Afraid we wouldn't find you. Afraid you might be hurt or worse. I couldn't hardly breathe through the fear. Then suddenly, you were there, and the relief nearly knocked me over. I think we stayed up together the rest of the night, watching the stars. I wanted to make sure you could find the North Star in case you ever got lost again. She turned back to me, reached out her thin hand, and placed it over mine. There were still tears in her eyes, but she smiled her lighthouse smile, and for a moment I saw her just as she used to be, just as she was the night I ran away and my mom found me. I squeezed her hand. I was scared too. I was afraid I'd be stuck out there. What made you think of it? Well, I've been thinking a lot about dying lately and... Don't, I interrupted. Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere. Not for a long time. It's okay, she said, squeezing my hand back. It's okay. I've known real fear and what I'm feeling now. It's not like that. I'm scared, I guess, but I'm at peace with it. I had such a beautiful life. I'm so glad I got to meet you, to be your mom. I'm glad, too, I whispered, voice breaking on the last word. But I won't let you go without a fight, I added silently in my mind. Something was trying to get to my mom. The strangeness began the day after I lit the candle. At first it was small blips, tiny wrongs that I chalked up to my imagination. Doors I knew I'd closed at night were open in the morning. Food began to rot and spoil within days of me bringing it into the house. Eventually, food would go bad almost immediately. Every few hours the television in the living room would either turn off if it was running, or on if it was off. Clocks would stop overnight, always at 3:03 a.m. Shadows began sticking to the corners of rooms independent of any light sources. The shadows were stubborn, and they would linger for as long as I would stare, then disappear when I blinked. I began hearing bumps and knocks at all hours, and sometimes, when I'd enter an empty room, I had a sharp, fleeting certainty that it was only just occupied. I avoided the dining room, except to check in twice a day to see if the candle was still burning. The smell was vicious, and would claw its way into your throat and nostrils the moment it was given a chance. I kept the door to the room shut, and kept air fresheners running in the surrounding rooms 24/7. The funny thing was, the candle never went out, never even seemed to shrink. I could see the wax melting, but day in and day out the candle refused to change. Days marched into weeks, and the wrongness only grew deeper. My mom and I both lost sleep to vivid nightmares that we couldn't remember when we woke up. Only the echoes remained, but those were enough to leave my pulse sprinting until morning. I started sleeping in a chair in my mother's room. I did this to comfort her if she woke up confused during the night, but also because, if I'm being honest, I was too scared to sleep alone. I felt like a child running into his parents' room, convinced there was a monster under the bed. Thing is, maybe there was. By the third week I couldn't keep doors closed. They would slam open the moment I left the room. A terrible scratching began inside of the walls. I told my mom it might be squirrels or mice, but the sound was so insistent, not like rodents milling about, more like a dog wanting in. I stopped leaving the house for supplies. Instead, I had what little food we ate delivered. I kept the curtains drawn. There was tapping on the glass every night. About a month after leaving the hospital, we were living like zombies. The dining room couldn't contain the smell of the candle anymore. The entire house was clogged with the scent. Tiny noises had graduated into full-on laughs and screams and whispers in the rooms around us. Something kicked the bathroom door so hard while I was taking a shower that the hinges warped. I covered every mirror in the house. I'd started to see things in the corners looking back at me, half-hidden faces, shapes that skittered away as soon as I turned around. Mom was drifting further and further away. She had long moments of confusion where she'd forget my name, forget where we were. Sometimes she'd think I was my dad. Other times, she'd just stare at the wall for hours, growing fainter and fainter each day like a Polaroid left in the sun. But she was alive. It was clear that we were under siege by something. My world shrank to only one room, and every trip to the bathroom or to answer the door for food felt like going over the trenches. The noises kept getting worse and worse, the shadows closer, the sense of movement around the house sharper. Every now and then, I would feel hot breath on the back of my neck or walk through a cold patch hanging in the air. I stopped bothering redrawing the lines of salt around the house. I knew, deep in my bones, that as long as the sickly candle burned, death could not take my mom away. On the 33rd day after leaving the hospital, I woke with a start from a nightmare, only to find my mom's bed empty. She hadn't been able to walk the past week at all, so my first feeling was hope that she might be improving, at least a little. Then I noticed the odor we'd been living with for weeks was gone. "Mom!" I shouted, running in bare feet out of the room. I found her in the dining room, the door wide open. She was standing at the table, frail as a neglected scarecrow, bobbing back and forth. Her hands were hovering over the candle. The flame was out. "Why did you do that?" I whispered. "Mom! Mom! Are you okay?" I padded into the room, the wooden floor freezing cold. My mother didn't react to my presence. She just continued rocking side to side. I realized she was still asleep. "Mom?" I gently shook her shoulder. "Wake up!" Her head snapped back, and she nearly fell. I caught her on the way down. It felt like she weighed nothing at all. "What's going on?" she asked, looking around the dark room. "Where?" "You're okay," I told her. "You were sleepwalking." "I was having the most unusual dream," Mom mumbled. "There were so many stars and—" She began to shiver uncontrollably. The cold hit me a moment later. I let out a gasp. The house was chilly before, but the dining room was near Arctic. My breath bloomed into a thin cloud in front of my face. I became acutely aware of the complete silence filling the house. Then I heard scratching. It was coming all throughout the house, deep tearing sounds at the walls around the dining room. Footsteps came immediately after, heavy and fast. Somewhere in the house, a window shattered. "Brian," my mother said, holding on to me. "Don't worry," I said. "Everything will be—" My voice deserted me as a massive shadow unfolded in the corner of the room. It was shaped like a man, but tall. So very tall. And it was fast. Before I could yell, the shadow was on us, pouring over my mother. In the space of a heartbeat, she was simply gone. "No," I whispered, clawing at the dissolving shadow where my mom used to be. "No, no, 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 no." The shadow was disappearing like a puddle sinking into the floor. There was a texture to it, oily and too slick to hold. I thought of my mother the night she found me lost in the woods, the night I'd run away. Her face filled my memory, her lighthouse smile. I remembered the relief I felt when she found me, the overwhelming love. I held on to that feeling, clutching it close. "You can't have her," I whispered. I closed my fist around the last threads of the shadow. There was a terrible sensation of pulling, It was like I'd caught a horse by the tail and it was trying to shake me. But I held on. A sense of ripping and being dragged. It was a riptide with a mind of its own. But I held on. It could not shake me. The temperature was dropping every second, and I felt my vision growing dark. The last thought that ran through my head before I blacked out was a promise to myself that even if I died, my grip would hold. I wouldn't let my mother's life slip away. All sounds and light faded, narrowing to a pinprick, and then going black. I woke up under a field of stars. I was lying in soft grass, still wearing my pajama bottoms and an old t-shirt. It was cool, wherever I was, but comfortably so. I stood up. There were trees all around me, tall and close, stitched together with shadows. Immediately to my right, there was a road that ran straight as far as I could see, blurring into the horizon. But the stars, they were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Bright ribbons of northern lights rippled above me in green and blue and purple. Stars lit the sky like millions of lanterns floating on a still ocean. The moon shone sharpest of all, a spotlight hanging above the tree line, so close I thought I could stretch up and brush its face. "You are persistent," said a voice from the forest behind me. I whipped around but couldn't see anyone. Then a dark spot began to clarify against the gloom. The silhouette separated itself and moved towards me. I recognized it instantly as the shadow from the dining room. As it moved closer, the thing grew and grew until it touched the sky and filled my vision. A deep dread sank into me, but I stood my ground. "Give me back my mom," I shouted. The silhouette pulled away from the sky, and then it was standing in front of me, the shape and size of a tall man. But instead of a shadow, the thing had wrapped itself in stars. Miniature constellations drifted across its body, floating slowly like a time-lapse of a clear night sky. Burning brightest was the North Star, blue and warm. The space between the stars was absolute black, not a shadow, but a complete absence of light. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "What are you?" I whispered. "You know," it replied. "Give her back," I begged. "Please, give her back." "I can't. It's her time. Past her time. You delayed me. Delayed her." I clenched my fists. "She didn't get enough time. I didn't get enough time. It's not right. It's not fair." "Of course it's not fair," the starry thing said. "But it's right. You each have your time. And at the end of it, there's me. And there's a road. And we walk it together." "Where to?" I asked. "Where are you taking her?" "I don't know. It's not for me to know. Only to know how to get there." "Then I won't let you take her." I planted myself in the road. The world was still and solemn around us. The constellations drifted like clouds, and a soft breeze stirred the branches. The starry thing didn't respond for a moment. "Your mother was kind and caring. Wherever she goes, she'll have peace," it promised. "But—" the creature raised its hand. "Did you ever stop to think that death isn't an enemy? Death simply is. It is the natural partner to life. It knows no prejudice or malice, has no designs or ambitions. Your mother spent so long suffering, felt so much pain. Instead of letting her rest, you took it upon yourself to draw her life beyond its given course. You kept her alive, but at the cost of stretching her thin, prolonging her sickness, diluting her. Did you keep her alive for her benefit or for yours?" I couldn't answer. "Stretching a life is unnatural, dangerous," it told me. "In the weeks you kept me away, you drew the attention of old things, hungry things, forces that would like nothing better than to swallow even the memory of your mother, to tear and bite until there was nothing left but pain and fear and a perfect emptiness." I shuddered, remembering the clawing sounds, the shattered window, and the laughter from empty rooms. I'm sorry, I whispered. Can they hurt her here? Is she safe? The stars in the shadow burned brighter for a moment. Your mother won't walk her road alone. None of you do. I walk with you, always, to the end. Can I see her? I asked. Please? Let me say goodbye. It considered for several seconds. You are persistent. And then the starry thing was gone. I was standing alone on an empty road. Brian? I turned to find my mother behind me on the road. She looked younger, healthier than I'd seen her in years. The frailty was gone, and my mother seemed exactly as I remembered her when she found me in the woods all those years ago. Isn't this the most beautiful dream? She asked, staring up at the night sky. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. A beautiful dream. I love you, Mom. I love you so much, so very much. She smiled and touched my cheek. I love you too. Don't cry. It's okay. I'll wake up, any time now. I'll see you then. I nodded, wiping at tears. Sure. Yeah. I'll see you then. What do you think is at the end of the road? She asked. Do you think I'll have time to find out before I wake up? I looked out at the road, scanning the trees for any hungry shadows. I don't know. I don't know where it goes, but promise me you'll be careful. My mom smiled wider. Of course I'll be careful. And she won't walk alone, said a familiar voice, behind us both. I turned, expecting the starry thing. But the man standing on the road was entirely normal. The light from the moon was enough that I could see he had moss-green eyes and a bright shock of red hair. Such a beautiful dream, my mother said. The man came towards us and took my mother's hand. He and I looked so alike, I could see why my mother confused us when she was sick. Take care of her, I told the man. Just please take care of her. Make sure she gets where she's going. There are things out there that want her, to hurt her. It's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The man squeezed my shoulder. She'll be safe, watched over. If the devil himself is waiting on the road ahead, he'll move. Or he'll be moved. I believed him. Thoughts raced through my head. There were so many things I wanted to say. Questions. A million ways to say goodbye. I wanted to stretch out the moment for as long as I could, but I realized I'd already delayed my mother enough. I love you, I told them both. Goodbye. I woke up back in my dining room, sitting at the table, the unlit candle in front of me. The house was quiet and still. There was no more scratching, no sound or sense of life at all. I walked through every room. The house was empty. I was alone. I've spent the past couple months working on the house, erasing the marks I'd made, fixing up the property. Some nights I take long walks out into the forest. I'm far enough out in the country that on clear nights it's like looking up at a sea of stars. I think about my parents the most during those walks. I grieve and remember in my own way. And I wonder where their road went, if they're still traveling, or if they reached their destination. I hope that their road takes them strange and beautiful places. When I walk at night, I look up for the North Star to keep from getting lost. Maybe they do the same. When it's full, I also look up towards the moon. I wonder if my parents had a chance to visit, to search for hidden oceans. I like to think they did, that the moon has at least one Maria, the one I love most. Don't let them in. Addiction slowly consumed our mother, rocking her back and forth before lulling her into a deep, sunken sleep on her mattress. When her back teeth fell out, she'd leave them by the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox, those missing pieces of her, kept safe so she wouldn't be lost forever. Maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house crumbled around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings were water-stained. The bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters, the radiators leaked rust. But it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me, with crooked band-aids on my bruised knees and lukewarm microwaved meals. She'd tell me ghost stories and didn't mind when I'd crawl into her bed later, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, the music channel on full blast on the TV, shaking our hips before they'd fully formed. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I'd scream and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he'd been, but I was blonde. Annie desperately wanted to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to run her hands through my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learned early on that we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking lightly, she shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes, when the weather was just right and she'd had enough of being drunk alone, she would call our school and say we'd both come down with summer sickness, and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her lean over our kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter, the radio loud, windows down, blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavily, she'd be out all night, her hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone for a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day we'd just wake up to an empty house and the fridge packed full. A post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick in the shape of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke rising to the ceiling. Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to block out the music they would blast until the morning, and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table, asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, the refrigerator a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once when I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet, then took every single cushion from the couch into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch for a while from the window, and then sat next to me on the floor, our backs pressed against the skeletal remains of the seats, her head resting in the hollow of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything, until her mouth started to shake and she started crying, at the breakfast table, into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her. She'd stay up until morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find Mom passed out cold on her bed, sure she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping, just like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and wiping the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd soiled herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October, and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night, and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, her voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoped we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she'd gotten the money for them. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness in the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down, Annie snapping grainy photos on her beat-up Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, Annie and I weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It had started when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, the gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I'd bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms, and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up, too. Couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair falling into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. And then I was running, my feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I'd run to the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we'd dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never put back. Outside, through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things, even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, my stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food, not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm.
As we ate in silence, with every bite I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner, or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike, the cat that belonged to junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding around my ankles. But Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped on the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs, watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside, and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah, yes, that one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines. Right next to the ashtray, left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, her voice quieter, her face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy. Let's wish. So we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time, and definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged, and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone.
It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back. Shoot, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, the grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing. A promise unfulfilled. Em. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Em. Get inside. Now. She was staring out into the dark, past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, her fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes, by the back fence, was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under their chin, their arms wrapped around their legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as they cried. Like a child, lost in the dark. Not like a child, but someone pretending. Mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright, their face still hidden by the dark. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move, animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it. We watched as the person slowly walked toward the house, their steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight, and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face, hard, and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, her nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at our fingers interlocked, both of us grown from the same bones. I'm going to call the cops, and everything is going to be... Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft, tap-tap-tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, the whites of her eyes showing how wide they were. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass, until they were slamming into the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped, and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, two at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once, and Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry, like a baby calling for its mother, filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, her feet jammed against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. What the heck is going on? I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, her thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to draw blood. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heartbeat in the base of my throat, wild and frantic. I'm going to get the phone from my room. I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. Yes, I'm going to get the phone, and I'm going to call the cops, and we're going to be okay. I shook my head again. It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door, and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me. Not for anyone. Promise me. I shook my head, and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. Yes. Promise me, Em. Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. Promise, she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, the bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, the handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll toward me on the tiles. And then, silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still, silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. Em? Came a voice through the door. I started, my hands gripping the knife. Honey, what's going on? Mom? My voice cracked. Mama, is that you? I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. Sweetie, it's okay. Just open the door. It's okay. Just let me in. The handle rattled again, gentler. Just let me in. It's all okay. She banged on the door, and I took my hand off the bolt. Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother. Please. Her voice broke, and she started to cry. Just let me in, baby. I'm so sorry. I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid, and I'd come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. Yeah, Emily, let us in, it's all okay. My hand froze on the bolt, and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, the handle rattling. Emily, let us in! Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, her voice getting louder and louder. Let us in! Let us in! Let us in! Over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters, all the bedtime stories we pray don't crawl out from under the bed. That's not my sister, and you're not my mother, I screamed through the door, my hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled into a ball, cradling myself, the knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled when I changed the TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low, guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long, scraping claw marks, dragged down to the floor. Pillows, ripped apart, covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly, as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, her face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all, standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together, no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time, and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail-thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had come to hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, so high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that come in a bottle or a needle, or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in.